schedule today. I am the vice chair of the commission. We are scheduled today to hear from Bella Robinson, representing COYOTE, Sydney Wardell, executive director of the Rhode Island Police Chiefs Association, Allison from the Attorney General's office, Melissa Broude, Shamus Outlaw, Advocacy and Rights Institute, SOAR, and Henry Binks, Commercial Sex Work. We've asked each of the people testifying to keep their testimony to 10 minutes or less, so that there is time for questions. We've asked those testifying to keep their testimony to 10 minutes or less, so that there is time afterwards for the members of the commission to ask questions of any of the people who have come to testify. And then after those questions, we'll go to testimony from the audience, from the public. So first on our list is Bella Robinson, representing COYOTE, Rhode Island. Bella?
Thank you, Rep. Jello. My name's Bella Robinson. I'm the executive director at COYOTE, Rhode Island. I've been a criminalized sex worker for 40 years. And while COYOTE supports all sex workers, it's important to understand that this study commission is about prostitution, criminalized sex workers, and the effects of recriminalizing prostitution in 2009. The government is now our boss because they create our work conditions. Sex work versus trafficking much has to do with someone's ability, the ability the person has to negotiate. Much of this depends on their personal situation, whether they can safely report violence and exploitation to the police. Do they have the ability to negotiate safe work conditions, the ability to negotiate their rates, condom usage, negotiate what services they're willing to provide, and the ability to screen clients. So in the report that's been uploaded to the documents, our research team included Tara Burns, who is a MA University of Alaska Fairbanks, Ali Benz, who was a MA graduate, University of Denver, graduate 2022, Colleen Fackler, BA MA Clark University, class of 2001, Miss Rothschild, PhD Northwestern, has presented at over 30 trafficking conferences, and she should arrive around 3:30 for public testimony. Sammy Cole, URI, who is interned and volunteered with COYOTE since 2020, and her advisor is Robin Linden, the political science professor at URI, who's on the Amnesty Board. Lila Rose, who's a sex worker and COYOTE's disability advocate, and two volunteers, Lindsay Bridges and Jennifer B. So between the cost of the ARPA request and the research stipend, we spent about $8,000 in 18 months reviewing tens of thousands of pages of charging documents. The methodology. It's important yet overlooked way of understanding criminal laws is to examine when and how they are applied, who they are applied to, and how those people or those who identify as victims are impacted. In this project, COYOTE has used public records requests to obtain charging documents in 36 prostitution-related felony cases that were charged by the AG's office over the last 5 years. We are told that the AG's office will be providing 2 more missing cases, but have not received them in time of publication. We believe to be a representative number of misdemeanor charges, 2,189 filed by individual police departments since 2000. In Rhode Island, police officers often act as prosecutors in misdemeanor cases, and also 12 federal sex trafficking cases charged in Rhode Island with 19 defendants since 2000. We track some of quantitative measures such as homelessness, victim status, law enforcement sexual contact, and the involvement of various agencies and task force, and utilized a focus group of current and former sex workers and sex trafficking survivors to help us understand the qualitative data. In April 2022, Blake Collins of the Attorney General's office was quoted to the Boston Globe claiming that current laws are not used against sex workers, referring to 18 counts of pandering charged in 2020. The AG's office had previously provided us with charging documents for what they said were all pandering cases over the last 5 years. However, in those files, there were no cases since 2020. We requested the additional 18 cases. We were provided another 14 cases for an additional $300, and we were also sent 4 cases from 2019 that should have been included in our original request. In 4 of the 14 pander cases since 2022, the defendant was a sex worker. In direct opposition to Mr. Collins' quote to the Boston Globe that current laws are not used to charge sex workers. Our emails asking whether other case referenced in the Boston Globe article existed or whether there was additional felony cases we were not provided in our response request went unanswered. We were unsure whether the omissions and mistruth were intentional, but they leave us suspicion of statements made by the AG's office and unsure whether we've been provided all the public records requested as required by Rhode Island's access to public records law. The main impact of recriminalization of indoor prostitution has been the repeated arrest and deportation of Asian spa workers. After the recriminalization of indoor prostitution, and again over the last 6 years, there's been a sharp increase in arrest of Asian spa workers. In 2021, Asian spa workers made up 13 of the 16 prostitution-related arrests. Police target Asian spa workers for rearrest, sometimes arresting them within a couple weeks of the previous arrest. The financial benefits from the repeated fines levied in these arrests, and the police and prosecutors were awarded $650,000 in a prostitution earning in just 1 spa case. At least 2 migrant sex workers were deported. Another traumatic impact of the recriminalization of prostitution has been the trauma of sting operations and the resulting breakdown of trust communication between law enforcement and people involved in the sex trade. We found 55 incidents of police engaging in sexual conduct with women during vice stings, mostly from Providence and Pawtucket. Asian women, women of color, trafficking survivors, and drug users were overrepresented in cases involving law enforcement sexual contact. A woman in East Greenwich massage parlor jumped from a 3rd-story window to try to evade police. We held a focus group to better understand why a woman would go to such lengths to avoid a misdemeanor arrest. Some women rather die than being outed as a sex worker. They will face a lifetime of discrimination in future employment, housing, child custody, etc. The laws are being used against the people they're supposed to protect. The pandering law is separate from sex trafficking. It makes a felony to do things like driving a sex worker if sex workers share a hotel room. In one case, an 18-year-old and a 15-year-old ran away from a group home. They met up with the 19-year-old sex worker, but later had a falling out with her. Then happened the 15-year-old shared a room with an 18-year-old. The first 18-year-old went back to the group home and told the police where the 15-year-old was. She and the other 2 18-year-olds were charged with felony sex trafficking of a minor. It's important to be clear and not left up to interpretation of prosecutorial discretion. In another case, a 28-year-old pimp was a supervisor of a group home. He had an 18-year-old man working for him as an enforcer, giving the girls rides to appointments and preventing them from leaving. An interview revealed that the 18-year-old refused to let one of the girls leave. He did not receive the harsh punishment as these 3 18-year-old girls who were their victim peers who had not been accused of trapping anyone into prostitution. He was charged with the much less offense of pandering. There's a lot more information in the report that I haven't had time to present today, so please read it. A few more main topics. Since 2000, there's been 11 federal sex trafficking cases with minors in Rhode Island. Since 2016, there have been 5 sex trafficking cases with minors in Rhode Island commercial sex industry and 2 additional cases with minors that were not involved in commercial sex. Of the 2,189 misdemeanor cases we were provided, 288 people had more than 1 arrest, 29 people had 10 arrests or more, at least 123 people had 3 to 9 charges, and 2 women had 25 prostitution charges. The current cost of locking someone up at the ACI for 90 days is $46,750. I'm sure it was lower over the years, but to think that we've spent millions of dollars locking these women up while we offered them nothing to help them with any issues or poverty. And going through the charging documents, we found most of the men that were charged with soliciting from a motor vehicle did not do jail time. They paid a fine, and they were able to have their records expunged after a year. So we've emailed this report to every member of the General Assembly, and we hope you read it, and we're always available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bella. You can now take your place up here beside me, and we will go to Sid Wardell Director of Rhode Island Police Chiefs Association.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Sid Wardell. I'm the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Police Chiefs Association. Have been serving in this position for approximately 8 years. Previously, 27 years in law enforcement, 10 years of those as Chief of Police. I do want to start by recognizing the members of the Commission who have participated in this, and I've had the pleasure of being able to sit with and listen to testimony and truly hear from folks that have, sat on this side of the table, that have put themselves out there and give some indication of their life experiences. So I first wanted to say thank you for doing that. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of that and participating in it. Secondly, I do want to say, though, that I am the executive director. I hold no authority. I am merely the person who collects all the information and sort of a secretary's position of the Rhode Island Police Chiefs Association. But I don't say that lightly. I do everything that we do amongst this group. I do share with my chiefs. I share with my executive board, and knowing that hopefully there is something that's going to come of benefit to all at the end of this commission. But I just want everybody to recognize that. I've reviewed every document that has been prepared. Bella, thank you. Very informative document that you have there. I'd really like to sit down at some point and go over some of that information that's there. I think some of it I think all of it is probably eye-opening. And that's one of the things about with law enforcement. We're not necessarily there reviewing how everything works, good, bad, or otherwise, okay? And so when our stakeholders bring something to the attention, such as this commission is doing, know that the community of law enforcement, the executives are looking to do what we can do to work with our legislators to right any wrongs that might be out there. But I do have to state also that, understand that the laws which are here that law enforcement does enforce are the laws that are put in place by our legislature and are somewhat representative by society, right? So society has obviously influenced on how those laws, what laws are enacted. So law enforcement is in a position, and most often we don't come here, especially at the State House, and actually give opinion about a law. We try to give factual information. And because I'll tell you, 39 cities and towns try to get the consensus on opinion isn't always able to do that. However, with that said, on all issues, all of our chiefs are in a position to be able to speak on their own behalf on any incident that comes up, and that does happen on a regular basis. So the documents most recently, and I spent over the weekend kind of looking through them again and trying to refresh my memory. 3 documents of note, Chapter 12, the sex industry and COVID-19. Just when we thought we have issues that are going on and then COVID gets thrown in the middle of it, and not recognize how that influences across the board, right? So although it's not equal on how it influences, there's nobody that can say that they weren't in some way affected in doing that. Policing, modern day slavery, career care in Rhode Island, and most recently the prostitution related charges, Rhode Island 2000 to 2023. All of those documents are providing a perspective of issues and concerns, and most of them suggesting remedies, which law enforcement, as I said, doesn't regularly get to consider those. So what has that done for me? What has that done for me in my position? It causes me to be sure that law enforcement is approaching any case of anything to do with sex trafficking, prostitution, pandering, or otherwise, juvenile or adult, to recognize that the individuals involved must be looked at as victims first. I think it's too easy for law enforcement to become maybe hardened to the system, and that when they're investigating something, it's always that you're looking at the side of the individual as committing some type of a crime, therefore they're considered a criminal. Specifically with cases like this, and I think we've done a lot of things, and one of them probably needs to be reassessed, which was noted in the report as well, is even just down to our MDT multidisciplinary teams, how we approach individuals that have been sexually abused or a part of, in any way, a part of our discussions here, and is how we approach those individuals. Law enforcement, there was some things that were brought out on protocol, and I think some of them were taken out of context, but we should look at that so that an individual looking at that document to be critical of what law enforcement is doing and what their intent, maybe we need to relook at how that wording is and be sure, in fact, that there was no intent of how certain circumstances are handled, like interviewing individuals, collecting of evidence, seizing of evidence, and those types of things. On a piece of paper, that's a very hard example of what you're telling somebody to do. But in the context of when you're doing it, I don't think in most instances it's done that way. Consideration of force or coercion. I think those are two great words that should be considered in some aspects of certain charging that we have in law enforcement, right? Goes to the pandering, goes to the assisting, goes to those other pieces. So there should be some consideration of force and coercion. Again, I think that lies on the level of our legislature in bringing that in. Reaffirm complaints of wraparound services in Rhode Island. Anybody that knows me and hears me testify, especially about services or non-services in the state of Rhode Island, will tell you that I am a firm believer and disheartened that the state of Rhode Island does not provide sufficient wraparound services. And that's on so many different levels. Unfortunately, my perspective, that many of the services we do and programs that we start with a grant program, which is a great way to get things started, but we don't continue to fund them. And I can tell you, when I was on the street with law enforcement and you go to do something in the area where you need wraparound services, nothing is more frustrating to be able to pick up the phone and the person that I talked to a week ago is still working at that job, right? And so, because that's where things get done. Let's be honest with each other. It's relationships. If I have a relationship that I can call you and you can call me, we can get through, I think, about anything. But if we're continually chasing whose responsibility is that, we get nowhere. And so most critical I will be is that the wraparound services for the state of Rhode Island, for those juveniles to begin with, but then, up through adulthood and housing and mental, all across the board, we need to do a better job in Rhode Island. And anytime I get the chance to say that, I will say that, and I'll stand with anybody advocating for individuals to get those services in Rhode Island. Probably the one statement that I read in one of the documents that probably hit me the most, and please take no offense if your issue didn't hit me the most, but to read something that says that a child in foster care is more scared in the foster care and feels safer on the street, that hurts. That should hurt as a society. That should hurt from law enforcement or anybody else that's there to work with individuals, right? So for me, that's the one that I kept going back to and recognizing, and we all know, right? It starts with our youth and the influences that happen with them, but when we can't provide them a safe place to be, first of all, we should be ashamed of it, but second of all, we certainly need to address that. To the heart of our conversations, decriminalization. I'm not going to tell you whether I truly think we should decriminalize any or all portions of the laws pertaining to this. But we, again, in order to do that, we have to look at certain areas on being able to support that. And obviously, we have the New Zealand model, I think, which is probably most representative of thereby being a society, country, stakeholders that recognized that they wanted to decriminalize, and they provided all of the supports that need to go along with that. If we truly think that we want to decriminalize any area of what we're discussing, we need to also have in line with that how we're going to support that practice of doing that, right? And decriminalizing and only regulating doesn't go far enough, right? So regulating just creates it a business, but there still needs to be that support that goes on that backside. So if we're not putting those wraparound services, healthcare, housing, and counseling, to name a few, those are things that we need to get in line and to do that. I will close to say again, or to add to the piece of the foster care, and I think which goes along with that, that fear of police is unacceptable to me, truly is. We need to do a better job in law enforcement to work with our stakeholders, not on judgment, not on what's the bad, what's happened in anybody's life today, good, bad, or indifferent, but being fearful of the police is unacceptable, and that lies on us. It's easy to read a report and read 3 or 4 instances which highlight the worst of the worst, I hope, is the worst. But in any fashion, it's unacceptable. And I believe that you will find that the Rhode Island Police Chiefs Association, in a number of ways, most recently in 2020, we came out with a 2020 for law enforcement, and in there talks to our stakeholders and working with communities and on whatever the issue is. But I can tell you that for me, it's unacceptable when somebody is fearful from law enforcement, and I mean that unacceptable from my side of the table. Madam Chair, that's all I have. If there are any questions, or if you want to do questions later, is that what you wanted to do?
Thank you, Mr. Wardell. I think we're going to wait for questions until everyone has testified.
Okay,
And then,
thank you.
all right. Next up, Allison Fonseca from the Attorney General's office.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Allison Fonseca. I am the new Policy and Legislative Counsel for the Attorney General, so bear with me. I am very new. I haven't had a chance to meet with you all and get to know more about what this commission is standing for, and so I'm grateful for the opportunity to sit here with you and hear more about the testimony. I do want to speak on behalf of the Attorney General. We don't have a comprehensive data and information to provide with you today, but I look forward to kind of furthering those discussions. I appreciate the report that was provided. I have shared that with our team, and we are reviewing it, so thank you. In general, our office does not prosecute prostitutes or sex workers. We do prosecute traffickers. From our perspective, the workers should not fear prosecution from our office, and they would be treated as victims in those circumstances. When prostitution charges are brought, they are often misdemeanors, so those would be prosecuted by local solicitors. So that is a brief overview. I know it doesn't answer a lot of questions, but I hope that it's a start, and I look forward to furthering those discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Melissa. Okay. Melissa and Henri. Henry? Henry. Henri?
I like the way you say it.
Okay, is that on? Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the Commission for allowing us to speak. I know that we're all working towards having some cohesive recommendations for the commission. And so I'm hopeful that our presentation, will briefly discuss some recommendations, and of course can do questions for everybody after. My name is Melissa Broude. I'm a longtime attorney and advocate for sex workers and survivors. And then I will give to Henry, who will start us off.
I am Henry June. I am a commercial sex worker, a consensual sex worker, second generation. I'm also the co-founder and co-director of the Ishtar Collective. We are a Vermont-based anti-trafficking and sex worker rights organization that's been in existence for the past 3 years. We focus on Vermont policy and direct aid, improving the lives of both trafficking survivors and consensual sex workers in the Green Mountain State, but we are into building a coalition. So firstly, I would like to thank all of the bodies responsible for facilitating this important study commission. I think there's a lot of stigma and a lot of misinformation around these really important topics, and the only way that we get to the truth is through a spectrum of nuanced understanding. So having sex workers and survivors at the same table has been a really important gesture from the Rhode Island State House, and I think that it was just a really good thing to do, so thank you, and thank you, Rep. Jello, and all other participants of this study commission. So to start off, I think moving forward, it's crucial for us to keep in mind the larger systemic issues that require our collective responsibility and care and our willingness to address. In the spirit of that personal politic, I'm going to open with what we're going to call macro reforms or big picture ideas, and how I believe you in Rhode Island can influence your citizens' lives for the better too. So these macro reforms, of course, on the subject of sex work, destigmatizing sex work. What that means is giving us a seat at the table. It means instead of steamrolling our identities and our experiences with rhetoric of either exploiter or exploitee, allowing us to be seated in our object idea of consent when we come to you with our wisdom, and hearing it no matter what place of moral panic we might be in, right? Because as sex workers, we're also dynamic people like other working bodies. We are parents, we're students, we're community leaders. Yeah, a lot of sex workers I work with in Vermont are also tradespeople. They're welders, they're plumbers. When I'm not an organizer and an advocate and a queer person and a sex worker, I'm also a vegetable farmer, weirdly. We have these big dynamic existences and a lot of perspective. We need to be addressing structural inequities like race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and strengthening reproductive rights access. Especially given the tone of the nation, I feel it's incredibly urgent right now that state legislative bodies act in a way that cares for our marginalized communities. That means deconstructing barriers for access to health care, gender-affirming care, reproductive health care. That means making sure that people feel safe coming to these institutions to us in the first place, if that makes any sense. Combating socioeconomic disparities. The rhetoric of rescue has to have integrity. Okay, so that can happen through policy that creates preventative care. We need to make sure that people who are exiting the sex trade and trafficking alike see success on their terms. This again means consent. This again means bringing people who are marginalized to the forefront in their speaking and their wisdom and listening to their needs, honoring what they are. Supporting LGBTQIA membership. There are so many intersections between consensual sex work, between exploitation, and the queer experience. And again, with national trends being what they are, it is urgent for states that value their queer and marginalized citizens to put those practices at play here, where it counts. Confronting racism, especially anti-Black police violence and the targeting of Asian massage workers. Bella did touch a little bit on the targeting of Asian massage parlors, so I don't want to be super redundant But the reality of systemic racism reaches all points of this nation. It's not a negotiable thing, it's a fact. And we are all responsible for what happens next in that, right? All of us. Whether we continue to allow racist violence to claim innocent Black and brown lives, or whether or not we decide to protect the lives of our marginalized neighbors, whose lives do matter. I think it's an issue much more complex than the time that we will allow for discussion here, but I'll touch on a recommendation that's based around my community. We can start investing resources for police to maybe cooperatively address complex situations around sex work and trafficking, to ask police to do the labor of de-escalation, rescue, detainment, and more is too much. Instead, we can look into the community-based resources of survivors and sex workers that are being cultivated here and other places right now, and rely on their skill for community care when their demographics are impacted. We also can ensure that all people have access to needed social services. You have to report your income when you apply for food stamps and housing assistance. You have to report your income when you apply for things like assistance and childcare. When you're a sex worker, you can't do that. Full stop. I'm facing those barriers right now in Vermont as I look for a new place to live, and I run a whole NGO on consensual sex work as a white lady. So when we're talking about making access points for marginalized communities, we're also talking about plucking out shame and stigma. You learn a lot of really excellent transferable skills in consensual sex work, like communication, counseling, co-regulation, advocacy. It would be nice to put these things on paper. And that's kind of more or less what I have. I'm going to hand the mic over to Melissa now. Thank you.
And hi, I forgot to ask if everybody had, I know that there were printouts, which has our recommendations, and there's plenty more extras, because I will be going through them quickly, but there is a printout that has all the bill numbers that I'm going to be referencing and links to those bills. So in terms of more micro, okay, so I should have mentioned it earlier. In terms of micro suggestions, more concrete legislative suggestions, which I know that, of course, we've been talking about for over a year since this commission began, there are so many that are actually currently pending in the state of Rhode Island and in many other states. So in that paper that has been handed out, there is a list, and always happy to provide more information. First and foremost, right, decriminalization of consensual adult sex work and related crimes, right? There is a pending bill in Rhode Island that would create a civil violation rather than a criminal penalty. And the need to address massage parlor workers, the criminalization, right, of Asian women that is rampant, not only in Rhode Island, it is rampant in New York, and in many other places where we see the arrest of massage without a license being a proxy for prostitution arrests. And then the added sort of insult to injury around immigration consequences and language barriers and so forth. Another pending legislation in the House and Senate is immunity, granting immunity from prosecution for people that come forward and report crimes committed against them or that they witnessed, right? We don't want people, if somebody chooses to come forward and report a crime, they shouldn't be thinking, oh wait, but I might be arrested for prostitution if I say, well, my client raped me. Right? If they want to come forward, they should be able to. If they don't for other reasons, that's obviously the individual's prerogative. But removing that barrier from reporting or seeking health care, right? If somebody goes to the ER after a sexual assault, we don't want people to be thinking, well, the rape kit, then the police are going to be involved and I'm going to have to disclose that I was engaging in sex work, so I'm not going to go seek medical services. Creating the crime of custodial sexual assault, there is a pending Senate bill that has been pending for many years in Rhode Island. I know that COYOTE has been very involved in that legislation. Rhode Island is one of 5 states that does not criminalize custodial sexual assault. Only one of 5. And actually in Vermont, where Henry does much of her work, they're actually in the process, hopefully will pass soon, of actually strengthening the custodial sexual assault law to include investigatory sexual assault as well. So Rhode Island is quite behind in that regard. Ensure healthcare providers cannot discriminate against patients. There is a pending House bill and Senate bill. Create the most comprehensive record relief for survivors and hopefully sex workers as well, so that people can vacate or expunge their records. The Polaris Project, which is a national anti-trafficking org, does state ratings, and they rated Rhode Island an F in terms of record relief for survivors. There are some good things about Rhode Island's record relief law. There is a vacatur for survivors, but it can be stronger. There needs to be confidentiality protections for when a survivor files a motion to vacate. There needs to be some shifts to the language that make it more expansive. And then the last one is removing laws criminalizing people who have STIs. This is something, that exists, in many states, and there's advocacy nationally on this. The pending decrim bill in Rhode Island, Senator Mack's bill, does shift, take away the criminalization of somebody that is arrested and is found to need medical treatment. So I would certainly recommend that. Those are, just some of the recommendations. And I know that obviously this commission will be working on a document sort of putting forth all of the recommendations. But yeah, thank you so much for your time.
I have just a closing thought. We've spent a lot of time considering everything that we've learned, and me, my co-director was a part of the study commission. They couldn't be here at this last hearing, but I am available to be a part of the drafting process for the final recommendations. Absolutely. And we are, of course, open for questions.
Okay, so we begin now with questions. And Justice, how about if you go first? Do you have questions?
Thank you. I was seeing if you were opening it up yet. I kind of have questions for all of you. Y'all are at the table, so I'll start with you, and then I'll move into you, Bella.
Everyone has a microphone now, so the
Great,
questions
okay.
Anyone with a microphone.
So I think the piece of the investigatory sexual assault, it kind of sounded like it connected back to some of what Bella said about the sting operations. And so am I understanding this correctly, that like a lot of times when these sting operations are happening, there are cops engaging in sexual actions with folks before they're arrested? And is that what's referred to as investigatory assaults in the bills you refer to?
Okay, so while I can't speak directly to data to answer your question directly, what I will say is that in the research I did leading up to the sessions where we had these conversations in Vermont, I found that the second most reported instance of abuse from police was sexual abuse. So there's even been a federal incentive program for states to strike down rights of sexual conduct between police and detainees, because with power dynamics, deceit, and imprisonment, consent does not exist, right? But I think what's important here is, like, regardless of the numbers, when we don't cinch up language like this, we leave big loopholes open for people to be abused. So it's kind of a preventative thing. We didn't have the numbers in Vermont, but we don't want them, you know? Yeah.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And then Bella, my question for you, you had gone through some of the particular charges or some of the particular numbers on reoccurring arrest. I don't know if I kind of want you to reread them, but I also have the report in my notes. So I'm curious about that recurring arrest, how is there a clear tie in sort of the research that you all have been able to do around like how that looks on a class level and sort of who, like, I'm curious if there's a relationship between that and homelessness, between that and other areas of identity and income that are coming into play.
And that's a great question. Thank you, Justice. In another report we did a survey. This is a way of bringing voices of criminalized people to legislature. So just last year, we surveyed 260-some people for a foster report, and we found out something. So when we asked, did you enter as a minor? You might be 30 now, but you entered at 16. They were less likely to overcome homelessness, more likely to be discriminated against shelters. They were less likely to be exploited. People who had already been exploited and disabled were more likely to be re-exploited again. So, and I wanted to expand on the sexual assault law because we've actually drafted the bill, and this is the 4th year it's stuck in committee. It's more than House of Hope and Coyote has documented a few bad apples threatening street-based workers to become behind a building or you're going to jail. But it also includes inside the ACI. Your parole or probation officer that's allowed to come into your home and go through your drawers and you're alone with this man. So anytime someone has the power to put you in a cage by threatening you, you can't consent. If I can't consent as a free woman, yeah. And we have a lot more information. I can email you a couple other reports. So thank you.
Thank you. And then one more question, and this is to Sid and to the AG's office. Nice to meet you, Allison. I know neither of you are in necessarily authoritative things to make decisions for the groups that you're a part of, but I am curious if you feel there could be action to support the bills that they have presented to us. I feel like obviously you will have to go back and see and look at the text of the bills, but particularly around, all of them, but particularly around creating the crime of custodial sexual assaults and granting immunity for granting immunity from prosecutions. Are those things that you feel you could make headway with your organizations to support in the State House?
Thank you. So I definitely appreciate the question. As you mentioned, I'm not in the position to decide whether or not we would support. I do think generally we are interested in learning more about the legislation, reviewing it. I'll definitely take it back to the team, but I don't have an answer right now. But definitely interested in learning more and addressing issues that definitely need to be fixed.
Thank you, Justice. I can tell you, so we look at 3 ways of our influence at the State House: testify for, testify against, or don't talk at all. The one area that we have some concern about is the immunity piece. A concern of whether it stretches too far to immunity if it's not particular to an incident where a sex worker or otherwise was assaulted. Okay, so we look at it more in the idea of the Good Samaritan law, right? Trying to line things up with the Good Samaritan law. So if it lines up with those purposes, I think we're in a better position of certainly not opposing. So that's one that I think we just need to look at some wording on how that is, because I will tell you, when I read it, and I'm not a lawyer, that in reading it, the concern that came across with us was how far does it go, and what the intent, does the wording go farther than what the intent was, okay? So that's on that one. And then the second one, which was what? Which was the custodial. Oh, the custodial. Yeah, we have, every time that bill has come up here at the State House, although we've never come out with a stance in favor, we've never gone against it. Unlike teachers and some other unions that have come out and talked about having authority over somebody and misusing that authority, they've been very vocal on doing that. We haven't. As the Police Chiefs Association, quite frankly, it's one of those things that I think is unacceptable.
Thank you, Justice. Sid, do you have questions?
I do, but I got to get back to my notes, so let me.
Okay.
I'm still getting ready for the questions coming at me, but I will, Madam Chair, if I can, in a
Okay.
couple of minutes.
Take a moment then. Allison, do you have questions for?
Not at this time.
Thank you. Charlotte?
I do not.
Gregory?
Thank you very much for everybody who's presented so far. I really enjoyed hearing everybody bring things to the table today. I also really enjoy the idea that there is a table here in the state of Rhode Island and that we're leading the nation in making sure that we aren't going backwards, that we're getting, in fact, ahead of the 8 ball on something that's really, really important. Listening to Mr. Wardell, I did have just like 1 or 2 questions for you. Forgive me, you know the answer to the first one. In the state of Rhode Island, did we first decriminalize and then legalize cannabis, recreational cannabis? Yes. Correct. That's something we've done before. Yeah, excellent. Do you... Mr. Wardell, please limit your answers to the questions that you've been given, if at all possible. As the head of the Police Chiefs Association, I wonder if you could kind of take the lead on explaining to viewers at home, people in the room that might not know the difference between a full-service sex worker, a prostitute, and somebody who's been involved in human trafficking. Can you explain that difference for us?
Thinking there's a loaded question here. So again, from law enforcement's perspective, and please excuse my back to you while I give this answer, but it really comes down to the intent of the individual, of what they're doing, right? When we're looking at, and even in the ideas of going to decriminalizing and then legalizing certain aspects with whatever it might be. I think again, I have to speak from society's side of it because law enforcement is there to just enforce the laws, right? So, when we look at, again, society, when we look at certain things that if they are not harming or causing an effect to someone else, that's where the idea of whether or not something should be criminalized, and here, we're talking about prostitution, the definition of what we have to go with prostitution. I don't know that there's a huge difference between prostitution and a sex worker for definition of law enforcement when we're doing the charging, if that's your question.
Oh, well, thank you. Let me be a little bit more clear. So what's the difference between just a person engaged in prostitution and somebody who is trafficked? Because as I understand this commission and the thrust of law enforcement against the pernicious part of sex work out there, human trafficking, I think it's important for everybody's knowledge, for you to explain the difference.
Sure. So trafficking is an individual who we would say is coerced or otherwise and threatened in doing whatever it is that they're being forced to do, right? So in this particular case, we're talking about perform sexual activity. So if the only way, the way someone that is looked at to be trafficked is they're not doing it by their own free will in any fashion or form.
Right. It sounds like sex slavery. I mean, trafficking it's a big word that not a lot of people get. So, but as the head of the Chief the Chiefs of Police Association for the state. It's important for people to hear that there is a difference between those two things. And that leads into my last question for you, Mr. Wardell. Can you point at, Bella and Coyote and SOAR and SWAP and all these groups have been doing lots of research to bring cases of when we get it wrong. And I wanted you to have an opportunity to tell us about an occasion here in the state where trafficking of humans, whatever their age or origins, was successful without increasing, as this commission is tasked with studying, increasing violence, stigma, health outcomes of a negative nature against marginalized people. Can you point at any in recent memory, or you can even dig back to 2000, can you think of any stings of human trafficking operations here in the state that the police got right?
I would absolutely say yes. I can't speak to any specific case to give you the facts on the case. I can give you general idea of that there have been cases where individuals have learned to be, it may be sex workers intertwined within there as someone who is being trafficked, with or without anybody else's knowledge that's participating at the same location. Let's use a spa, for instance. The individuals that some know each other, some don't, but there's certainly been cases where law enforcement has learned of the activity that was going on, which is against the law, investigated, and then ultimately found out that there was individuals that were being trafficked there. And we have to look at the word traffic. If we're going to define or we're going to try to, put this in perspective, trafficking doesn't have to be that they came from another country, brought here against their will, and forced to do, in this case, sex acts. Certainly, trafficking can be an individual who is from the area, but is brought to perform these types of acts against their will, coerced to do so. That person is being trafficked.
True. Well, thank you. I look forward to doing some research, or perhaps your association can provide specifics where run-of-the-mill, everyday, full-service sex workers were not harmed in a sting that brought down an operation that had been trafficking or coercing people into sex work. I think it's a really big role for law enforcement in the state to continue to do, and we all want to support you in doing that, while also reducing the opportunities for harm, violence, and stigma against other people, especially marginalized folks. So thank you so much. For the AG, can you, whenever you have it, Ms. Fonseca, can you bring us arrests in the state on trafficking? That would be important. There's a lot of anthropological data that we can all go out and do. There's a lot of different types of research that we can do. But if we can get real hard numbers on when trafficking rings have been busted up by John Q. Law, we all want those stories because we want to support you guys in what you do. And thank you for
The follow-up for that. Are you looking for it? You said big rings. Can it be a smaller scale? What kind of
any arrests that involved a coerced or forced individual who was participating in sex work, either full service or otherwise, and big rings, that would be great. I'm sure I could just go to ProJoe's search page and find one or two of those if they happened. And thank you for letting us know what the stance is from the AG's office. We're all glad to have you there. For our friends from SOAR and Ella, you said that there were that there were some common sense pieces of legislature that could move funding and move resources from some institutions to others, and at a local level or municipal level, as well as state levels, it might be possible to do that. So are you pointing at situations where it makes sense to kind of, if we have like a finite pie, rather than going out and holding a bake sale so that we can fund care, community, and wraparound services, to maybe move funding around between agencies and institutions?
So, I personally dream of a world where marginalized communities are at the forefront of the discussion around their needs. And I feel that in order for that to happen, when marginalized communities come together and organize, they need to be invited to larger systemic conversations like this, and that includes policing. Again, when I said that asking the police to do the forefront of the criminal justice work as in the de-escalator, the rescuer, the detainer, the investigator, that's too much of a labor load for any human, full stop. And that's too much of an emotional load for any one sector of work. There are too many nuances present. I don't have any legislation to push here in Rhode Island today, but what should be happening, in my opinion, is that when we have these conversations about what is the difference between trafficking and consensual sex work, no shade. I feel I'm qualified to answer that question. I feel I'm very qualified to answer that question because I sit in that experience and I'm interacting with those community members in real time, away from abstractions like numbers, academic language, and data. I live that life, right? And some other members of this commission that are here today do too. I live as a consensual sex worker who works in anti-trafficking, and we do effective work because we make sure that we are listening to the needs of trafficking survivors when they come to us. Not everybody's solution looks the same, right? I don't think it's a matter of legislation only. I think it is a larger matter of the distribution of power. Yeah, I should probably turn this off now.
Hey, thank you so much. That really sums it all up. Community, right? Relationships, as Mr. Wardella was reminding us. Hey, thank you. That's all that I have from Amnesty Local Chapter 1016.
Thank you. Bella.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to clear up a few things. And first of all, I want to say, Allison, I know you're brand new, so please don't feel picked on, okay? I know you don't know this. But even the ACLU has confirmed that in Rhode Island, we have affirmative defense. They arrest victims. When you go to court, you can say I'm a victim and they can't prosecute you. They've traumatized you with arrest. You've ended up in the news. And whether you're convicted or not, and I know this because I got my first solicitation charge 2 weeks after I was 18, they withheld the adjudication. You cannot do anything in life the rest of your life. You will be discriminated in child custody, housing, future jobs, and the state will even take your kids if you're just a stripper without really proving you're a bad mom because the stigma runs that deep. And while the AG's office is telling you to come here and tell us that they're not arresting sex workers, it's in the charging documents that we spent 18 months, it's in their words. And again, I love what you said, Sid, and I think you totally got it right that we don't have the wraparound services. And down here, let's applaud the people, because there's a big problem of housing 15-year-olds with 20-year-olds in the same foster homes. When you're 18, you need to go to a halfway house that's for young adults and be treated like a young adult and not be treated like a 12-year-old. So a lot of the problem is, and also when you talked about the immunity bill, there were 2 bills, and this is what the issue. One was the massage thing. We don't want to leave them out. Because in 2016, we've made it illegal to say body rubs or body works without a massage. I Googled, and in 2022, there was only 79,000 licensed massage therapists in the entire country. There's only 40 or 80 in Rhode Island. And all the girls that are on the website saying body rubs and massage, they're not getting arrested. The ICE and Homeland are coming here and doing racist massage rage and deporting Asian women. The second part about the bill is it only said crimes. Our version said kidnapping, rape, assault, trafficking, bad things. The problem with leaving just crimes, now this was if you were a witness or a victim of a crime. A client could come say, if you want to have unprotected sex, I'm calling the police and telling them you're a prostitute and I'll get immunity. When you don't list what crimes, things like that could happen. But part of it was, if a client goes to a hotel thinking he's going to see someone my age, and I'm 14, he can dial 911. There's no way to make 911 calls from payphones anonymously. So is it worth getting someone for a misdemeanor and letting a predator continue to go on? I love what you said about the youth. Federally, trafficking is forced coercion or fraud or a minor. Even if the minor's under their own control, federally and state law says you were a victim. As far as adult victims, you've never found a trafficking victim in a Rhode Island spa yet, never. In charging documents, when police are saying certain people are victims because they're conflating the issue without the worker saying, like, if I say I'm a victim, then I'm a victim. But you can't say I'm a victim when I'm saying I'm not if I'm over 18. So there is a big conflation, and a lot of this is money. Congress is spending $500 million a year giving money to nonprofits that will do certain things, create awareness about trafficking, host public trainings on how to spot it, encourage people to call the police on sex workers. Don't support DCRIM and don't talk to people like Bella or sex worker rights organizations. After 20 years, it's like QAnon. A man shot his wife in the head 3 times because QAnon told him his wife worked for the CIA and trafficking. Remember Hillary in that pizza parlor basement over a decade ago? So this is creating stigma. Stigma always increases violence and exploitation. And you're right, we have a broken system because the wrong people are getting the money. And we started a program helping the women coming out of the ACI to better understand the issues. The sober houses are in the drug neighborhoods. When they relapse and go back to the street, they tell them where all the girls are. For some reason, these places getting all this money can't give the women clean underwear and clothes, but we're doing it. When a sex worker's beaten up and her teeth's punched out, she don't call you or the police, she calls me, and I gotta go pick her up and take her to the dentist and heal her. And we're not saying all people are bad, this is black or white, but I would like to extend it. I'm gonna give you both Allison cards, and I would like to have meetings with you so we can sit down. We can't do this all here in 20 or 30 minutes because this is about public safety. And we found minors are on Facebook looking for pimps and third parties. When you're 17, you don't have a debit card. You can't call an Uber. When you're running away from abusive foster homes. Just last week, the FBI arrested 2 Providence police for a big fentanyl ring. And guess what happened the week before that? A 15-year-old ran away from a group home and overdosed and died in a hotel. None of that had anything to do with commercial sex, but that stigma and shaming kids or poor women that are trying to pay their rent can't be a solution. And there's no one against sex trafficking more than sex workers. And thank you.
Thank you, Bella. And now, Melissa or Henry, do you have questions? Or did we already ask? No.
I guess this is a question for you, Chairwoman, or anyone, just what the next steps, or perhaps that's to be discussed, when the Q&A is wrapped up, but next steps is to recommendations and all of that from the Commission.
My understanding is that next steps are that we put together recommendations for the General Assembly. And so that is now those of us here today and others who are missing today have undoubtedly ideas of what we would recommend to the General Assembly. And so that is our next step, putting all that together. And we have a next meeting scheduled for May 22nd, I believe. And so by that time, I think we want to have ideas to talk about. That's as specific as possible, I think. Because we don't have a lot of time before the end of the General Assembly session.
I did have just a question or two and just an offer for collaboration. I don't know what kind of official follow-up after May 22nd is going to take place, but this does feel like a longer conversation, and so I'm available to have that with members of the study commission as well. I did have a question for you. Said you did mention that the Rhode Island's Police Chiefs Association had a document or something you were circulating with the community on things that y'all wanted to do better. Was that the understanding, or was that the nature, the tone of the document?
So we did a what we called 20 for 2020, and those 20 points of, and it covered a broad range. They weren't. I can tell you there was nothing specific to our topic. However, there was items in there towards community relations, open communications, and those types of things. So, yeah.
I guess my follow-up question, because you've had such a long-standing experience on Rhode Island Police, could you gauge a willingness, of course, you can't speak for the force at large, but do you suppose that the Rhode Island Police Department would ever be open to having collaborative kind of strategizing conversations on how to better deal with survivors of trafficking and, what our not to be punny, but our bedside manner, as far as
Wait.
caring. Thank you. I'm a punny guy.
Not your first time.
No. I love the dad jokes. I guess I'm just curious to know where the police department would be at in accepting constructive guidance from Sex Worker Rights Organization. Bella's been working here for over 20 years, right? 15 in Rhode Island, yeah. I've been working in Vermont for a few years, and I've been a sex worker for almost a decade. So, I think that there's a lot of wisdom that could be exchanged and offered in those spaces. Do you think that Rhode Island PD would be willing to have those conversations with those organizations who will probably discourage them from policing?
Sure, bless you. And that was actually my question, Madam Chair, was to ask you what you could share experience-wise in Vermont, that you've had some type of implementation of lived experience, where you've incorporated that in the process, anywhere in this process, right? So I had mentioned our MDT, our multidisciplinary teams, that we use, that is really a policy-driven to keep everybody on track when investigating. Started with minors, right? Sexual assaults, those types of things, and is broadened in when it's being used, but we don't have anybody with lived experience that's a part of those discussions in doing it. So that's where I was going when I mentioned the MDTs. I don't think we would ever be closed to having conversations that we can find a way to incorporate lived experience, and that's new, right? That's not something that had happened in the past, but is something that needs to be recognized because we're not there with lived experience of individuals that we're dealing with, and I think there's a benefit to everybody. I'm glad you stopped, though. I'm going to say one thing. I'm glad you stopped and didn't ask on the stance for Rhode Island law enforcement on supporting decriminalization in total, right? So that's a much tougher question. And it's not because all 39 cities and towns might not have their own answer. That's the problem. They all have their own answer, right? And who they have to answer to and whether or not they could support something like that. Discussion that's coordinated by the Rhode Island Police Chiefs Association with any group, in particular talking with you or others, Bella, whoever here, never out of the question, would want to do that. As you pointed out, I have a large number of years in the service.
You said it first.
But I can take criticism, and if it's for the betterment of everybody, I think that's where we'll end up in a better place. So.
I guess my final question might actually be for the vice chair. Will you be in contact with members of the study commission if you have questions or concerns? And are members of the study commission allowed to contact you after the commission?
I encourage members of the study commission and others in the room or watching to contact with me. I think my job is to act to pull it all together. So thank you. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah.
And now, I think we've maybe heard all the questions from the members of the commission. I'm going to suggest Melissa and Henry, not Henri, to come up and take places here on the dais so that you will have microphones available. And then we have just 2 people signed up to testify, though we have time. We have until 4 o'clock. It's just 3:15 now. So we have just Gabrielle Monroe and Tatiana Rothschild who have signed up to testify. So Gabrielle and Tatiana, if you would take seats at the table. And others listening, if you would like to speak, you can talk with the clerk, and it's not too late to sign up to testify. Thank you. So please introduce yourself, the woman in the gray t-shirt first.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your time today. My name is Gabrielle Monroe, she, her. I am a national activist, advocate, author, Survivor Siblings co-founder. Survivor Siblings is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to education and information on sex trafficking that is combined and presented by sex trafficking survivors only. I am also a child sex trafficking survivor, a houseless youth who traded sexual services for my survival needs, as well as a career prostitute for almost 25 years. I have worked as a prostitute in 43 states, including here in Rhode Island. I am the communications director for COYOTE Rhode Island and the host of COYOTE's Sex Worker Storytelling podcast series. First, let me start with saying I am not a victim of prostitution. I am a victim of state-sanctioned violence that targets prostitutes thinking we want to be saved. As a prostitute, I can say that we do not want to be saved. We want access to our rights like every other person who has a job. My dad was my first sex trafficker. He trafficked me at ages 9 to 10. I did not enter into sex trafficking. I was a child being raped by grown men. Furthermore, I was not a 9-year-old prostitute. During previous testimony, the CSEC 101 presentation that is still documented as facts with this study commission, there are several things that simply are not true. I was offended as I watched the study commission as these untruths were being presented. First, CSEC, which stands for Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children, is a term made up for marketing rhetoric for both governmental and NGOs to raise funds. This term is tone deaf of the realities sex trafficking survivors experience. Nicening up the terminology of child sex trafficking, which is a form of child sexual abuse and a form of child rape, is doing harm to child sex trafficking survivors, adult sex trafficking survivors, and prostitutes alike. I am a child sex trafficking survivor. I am not a commercially sexually exploited child because it is easier for some folks to hear. I was raped by grown men for profit when I was only 9 years old. This presentation claims the demand for child prostitutes is at 46%. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean, is this presentation saying that 46% of adults in Rhode Island are trying to sex traffic children? Are they saying that 46% of adults in the country are trying to sex traffic children? Furthermore, how can they get accurate statistics on the demand for something that is child rape? I'm going to guess that this statistic is nonsense based on the sick and twisted savior fantasies of whomever fabricated this number. Another part of this presentation states that in 2017, Rhode Island served 100 CSEC victims. Where did this number come from? And more importantly, did these alleged CSEC victims self-identify, or were they stripped of their own identity rights and identified by the police or carceral system against their will? Who identifies victim versus worker? It's almost always law enforcement or our carceral system. Furthermore, how exactly were they served? Years later, what is their current quality of life? Have they moved on from being survivors to actually thriving in our communities? The arrest numbers for sex trafficking in Rhode Island for 2017 doesn't match up with this statistic in the CSEC 101 presentation. Sex trafficking is a form of abuse. Sex trafficking is not prostitution. Prostitution is a career that is morally judged and stigmatized by society to coerce morally different, mostly women, into religious-based compliance. Prostitution is not a form of abuse. It is abuse to force prostitutes to identify as abuse victims when we are saying we don't want to be saved, we want rights. And we as prostitutes do not need to be rescued by the police or anyone else. On December 27, 2019, reporter Rich Lord published an article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette with research stating that less than 1% of sex trafficking arrests were actually related to sex trafficking at all. This means that 99% of the time, law enforcement was using anti-trafficking funding to target prostitutes who are consenting adults. We're not asking to be saved. Instead of law enforcement investigating and arresting those who sex traffic and rape children and adults, they mismanage these funds and arrest consenting prostitutes. I would like to request this commission vote to remove the CSEC 101 PowerPoint as it is full of misinformation and it is not driven by actual survivors of sex trafficking. Please listen to prostitutes who have lived experiences instead of those who have been benefiting off of saving us. There are many organizations out there that collect hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in saving us when we don't want to be saved. We want our rights, resources, and protections just like every other worker has. Prostitution is not inherently violent. Men who target prostitutes are violent. Violent men who target prostitutes target us because we are criminalized and we have no rights under the law. A month after FOSTA SESTA was signed, I became sex trafficked by somebody who, it went on for several months, and it went on at his business. After I had got frustrated, I called the boss of the business and explained everything that was happening to me. And you know what he said? What are you gonna do, call the cops? They'll arrest you for being a prostitute. So here I was being sex trafficked with no protection from the police to protect me, but these privileged, white, wealthy business owners were protected because I would have been arrested for prostitution, which doesn't even fit the definition of what a crime is. Conflation is when two unrelated things are merged into one. Sex trafficking is not prostitution. Sex trafficking and prostitution are conflated to benefit the bank accounts of those who want funding to save us, both prostitutes and sex trafficking survivors, while taking away resources from both prostitutes and sex trafficking survivors. I was not a 9-year-old prostitute. I was a 9-year-old being raped. I am not a 42-year-old sex-trafficked woman. I am a 42-year-old prostitute trying to survive the targeting and criminalization, mostly from my own government, who wants to save me when I don't want to be saved. My first sex trafficker, my dad, was murdered over 30 years ago. Over 30 years later, there are no more resources available for child sex trafficking survivors as there were in 1990. In 1990, there were no resources for sex trafficking survivors. There wasn't even a definition for what was happening to me. We called it my dad traded me to men to rape me in exchange for drugs and money. Sadly, over 30 years later, in 2023, there are still no actual resources for sex trafficking survivors. My organization, the beginning 3 months of the pandemic lockdown, reached out to multiple anti-trafficking organizations to look for resources so sex trafficking survivors could leave their abusers, and not a one of them had a single resource. Our requests were anything from housing, funding to get people into long-term hotels until they can find permanent housing. But the most simplest request that I called well over a dozen anti-trafficking organizations looking for was a sex trafficking survivor. She is autistic. I'm autistic as well, and so I understand her need. Her trafficker took her shoes, and she needed a very specific pair of shoes to work with her sensory needs for her autism, and the shoes were $40 on Amazon. Over a dozen calls later, and not a single anti-trafficking organization could come up with a $40 Amazon gift card to get this poor woman her shoes so she could very simply put them on her feet and walk away from her abuser. Sex workers, more specifically prostitutes, fundraised and came up with that money, and we had those shoes to her in 2 days, and she put them on her feet and she walked away from her abuser. She didn't want help from law enforcement because law enforcement oftentimes arrests sex trafficking survivors as a way of saving us. In Pennsylvania, where I currently live, the arrest for prostitution is not expungible. So sex trafficking survivors are being arrested, and now they are having lifetime barriers created for the abuse that they were a victim of. They won't get a job, they won't have housing. I was arrested in 2004, and I have barriers with jobs, housing, and more. I even had my child taken off of me by the police 12 years after my arrest. Very simply because I was arrested for prostitution 12 years earlier, and I was told that I was not a suitable mother. I had to take the state to court to get my child back, even though I was living in Florida at the time, and both the Florida police as well as Florida Children's Services both stated that there was no wrongdoing, that my child was simply just a runaway to return her to me, and they refused because I was arrested for prostitution. Mismanagement of anti-trafficking funding and conflating sex trafficking and prostitution to target prostitutes is a form of abuse against both prostitutes as well as sex trafficking survivors. This removes resources from sex trafficking survivors. Anti-trafficking funding should never be used to target or arrest prostitutes. Since 2000, there have been only 11 federal sex trafficking cases, and since 2016, there have been 5 state cases that Bella had spoke about earlier. That is less than 20 sex trafficking cases, many of which very possibly could have been sex trafficking victims being criminalized as prostitutes. How were they identified? Did the police identify them as sex trafficking victims, or were they able to self-identify? Were they youth who were trading sexual services? Because when I was 16, I walked into a food bank to get food, and they offered to call the police for me. I didn't want the police. I didn't want a group home. I was doing better on my own, but I had no access to resources. I couldn't check into a hotel, so on nights that were too cold or it was just raining too much, I had to go behind the bar and get whatever guy would take me to a hotel just so I had that hotel. I had to trade sexual services for my very survival needs because the state does not provide youth who are homeless with any sort of resources. A majority of the CSEC 101 presentation is inaccurate, and I am requesting it be immediately removed from this study commission, as well as removed from the website. The general public sees this, and they take this as facts on what sex trafficking is, when in reality, it is not. This presentation goes on to say that proof of identifying trafficking is about having nice clothing and fancy lifestyles and tattoos, when none of that was actually true when I was 9. When I was 9, I was being told by grown men that I'm a woman now, and this is what women do. And because I am autistic, I absolutely believed them and didn't understand I was being raped at the time. When I realized I was being raped at the time, there was no way for me to get out of my abuse because I was 10 years old. My dad was murdered by somebody who, and I'm not taking anybody's agency, but by definition of the law, she was also a sex trafficking victim of my dad. And she ended up doing jail time instead of being crowned the savior she was. She saved my life. I'd be more than willing to put together a presentation.
Gabrielle, can you begin wrapping it up now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'd be more than willing to put together a presentation by actual sex trafficking survivors and meet with anyone in person or via Zoom to discuss the differences between sex trafficking and prostitution. They are not the same thing, even if they do sometimes occur at the same time. Also, there is Melissa Grant's Beyond Strange Bedfellows, which shares some great insight about the prevailing narrative on trafficking and how different governments have morphed this trafficking narrative. We would love to provide you a copy of this. We do have folders with that and more information that was put together by COYOTE, Rhode Island. Let us know that if you would like those. I appreciate your time today. Thank you very much. After listening to the different testimonies that I heard here today, I am confident that this study commission will center people with lived experiences and do what they can to decriminalize and protect prostitutes while providing rights, resources, and protections to sex trafficking survivors as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Tatiana.
Can you all hear me? Okay. My name is Tatiana Rothschild. I am a PhD student at Northeastern University. I'm studying political science. I've been involved in the anti-human trafficking field for over a decade now. My research currently is focusing on how national governments select the anti-human trafficking policies that they do, how they frame those policies and justify them to the public, and how the impacts of those policies on the communities in questions are framed by survivors and advocates who either disagree or agree with the national government's framing. I apologize for coming in late. I came from Boston, but I was able to hear the testimony through the live stream on my way over here. And I have a lot of thoughts. I came today ready to talk about the harms of criminalization and the importance of a study commission like this, which I think we all know to some degree as we're here. And I think in hearing everything, I can't say it better than it's been said. I will briefly reiterate that criminalizing any industry, any social group, any group of workers is inherently going to increase the exploitation in that sector, no matter what you're looking at. And I can't speak to the specifics that have been so aptly represented here today. I think what I want to reiterate a little more are the political mechanisms that go behind that. The way that we would expect criminalization to impact any industry is exactly what we've seen and heard today, right? None of this is a surprise from a policy perspective. When you criminalize, criminalization is like the formalization of any kind of stigma, right? It inherently creates formal mechanisms through which income, housing, child custody all become more insecure and jeopardized by the act of criminalization. And we've heard the specifics of this in regards to sex work today, right? And as the study commission is moving forward, I think the primary thing that I want to share is the hopes, not just that survivors' testimony, sex trafficking survivors and sex workers' testimony and research, this community-driven research that has been presented by so many amazing groups here today, is not only included in the studies commission, but is is truly centered in the design that the commission decides to move forward with, that the advocates and actors brought onto the commission will be centered, that their voices, their opinions, those differing needs and perspectives will be centered as much as possible. Henry, you said that most of this comes down to the dynamics of power that we see being employed in all of these different circumstances. And as someone who has read an absurd amount of policy impact reports by nonprofits, by state organizations, I want to point out to the commission that the very act of evaluating how your own policies are being enacted, what the intended and the unintended consequences of a policy are, studying these policies themselves is an exercise of power. For the state to evaluate itself is an exercise of power. And I think the testimony provided here today is so illuminating. And as a person who's just been in this field for a hot minute now, I have seen so many circumstances in which great people have been brought to the table and then ignored by the processes that have been created, or perhaps allowed at one table and not another, right, where the report is maybe created well but not listened to in another circumstance. And part of what we've heard from these amazing recommendations is this moment that Rhode Island is having as it evaluates so many different policies, as different bills are being proposed for immunity. We have this real opportunity to engage with this topic really critically. And I'm so excited for that as a person who lives in Rhode Island and works in this field. I love that. And also, I want so badly for this to be constructed in a way that allows for critical examination, not only by the commission, but for critical examination of the people who are going to read this study report and the policymakers who are going to make the decisions at a different table, right? I think I'll end there. I could talk on this topic forever, but I really appreciate the existence of such a commission, right? This is necessary work, this is good work. And I appreciate, even in reading the notice of the commission, how things are being organized, the research that's being represented. But I do hope that the commission will center community-driven research in this endeavor and will construct the report in such a way that other policymakers will be able to engage critically with this political issue as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. Looks like we have a third person from the public who would like to testify. Please state your name first. Yep, the red button should be up.
Okay, here we go. Hi, I'm Samantha Cody. I am a volunteer with COYOTE RI. I am a Rhode Island College student, currently not enrolled, but I study political science. I am also on the spectrum, and I've been on disability benefits for several years. And the only comment I wanted to make was that a lot of people today have been talking about how one of the biggest barriers is accessing services which are difficult to facilitate or to figure out how to get. And a lot of, when you are able to access these services, it makes choosing other alternatives less desirable. If I hadn't been given disability benefits when I was turning 18 and unable to really work to support myself, I may have had to turn to other things. And that's one of the reasons why I like working with COYOTE and supporting this advocacy, because it's not just about specifically sex work, even though it is. It's about trying to find ways to make it so that people can support themselves and that people have the government there to not punish them for finding ways to support themselves in the best way that they could at the moment. So, thank you.
Thank you. Now, are there questions from the members of the commission? Melissa.
I might be stealing your mic. Just so quickly, just I guess just a sort of a point of clarification with Ms. Monroe. So the CSEC presentation was, just to contextualize, I believe April 25th, 2022, exactly a year ago. And I was asked to present on the distinction between sex work and human trafficking, and former chairwoman, Rep. Anastasia Williams, had asked Danielle, I am blanking on her last name at the moment, yes, who identified as a survivor of human trafficking, to present so that it was somewhat of a counterpoint around the different advocacy models, right? And I think anything, I of course defer to the chairwoman and the commissioners about how to handle that presentation, but I'm more than happy to get in touch with Danielle to connect those dots. I just wanted to sort of contextualize that particular presentation, and I, again, whatever makes sense to move forward to have the proper record.
The majority of that presentation is based on criminalizing prostitutes instead of what actual sex trafficking is happening. If you look at the bottom of the presentation, it says where you can find sex trafficking survivors. I try not to use the term victim because even whenever I was in victim status, I was still surviving. The majority of those say in brothels, in massage parlors, at strip clubs, at hotels, blah, 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 blah. The majority of child sex trafficking, it happens, is either familial or through our broken foster system. And concentrating about 90% of those places where we can find sex trafficking survivors is a disservice to actual sex trafficking survivors who are not even being spoken about or represented. Those are the sex trafficking survivors who need rights, resources, and protections the most, when sex workers that are all listed on there are not asking to be saved. So that entire presentation is about criminalizing mostly prostitutes and not talking about the children who are trafficked. I was sex trafficked in 1990.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
Well, I was sex trafficked with a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, and an 11-year-old, all in the span of about 6 months. We're not reaching those sex trafficking survivors.
Thank you. That's clearly something that needs looking into. Thank you. Are there other questions?
I had one quick comment. And first of all, I'd like to say that I think Danielle's experience was just as important as everyone else in her video. But I do understand when the public clicks on that document, they think the average age of prostitution is 13. And that has been repeated to the point billions of dollars are being spent and everyone's a victim and they're missing, we're not fixing a youth system. So I think it is problematic because when we sit and listen to that, we're really traumatized and triggered to have to listen. But I think her video and her experience counts just as much as any, but I would suggest that that slideshow in Fact Street full of fake information is removed from public view. Thank you.
I'd like to say I agree with you, Bella. I do support Danielle's story and testimony, but I do not support keeping the information that wasn't accurate on record. I have some other things though. Is that okay?
Justice?
Cool. Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for coming and for testifying. I really do appreciate each of your testimonies. Gabrielle, I really appreciate what you shared with us and how you shared it. I wanted to elevate the piece that you said, that you both all shared really, about how do we involve the public in the process of the report and the recommendations we're going to do, because I'm unclear how we're doing those things as a member of the commission, and I think we need to be very intentional, which means it might not happen. We can have some recommendations and maybe support some of these bills that have been suggested to us for this session, but I think we need a longer process to really be able to hold folks. I know my communities who I reached out to about this hearing had a very difficult time because we had only heard about it last week, and so they could not mobilize to have folks here for public testimony. And the bigger piece of that is that the stigma attached to sex work is it's not just getting folks here, it's the fact that folks don't feel comfortable testifying in this committee on public record about their own experiences. And so if we're going to include the public, if we're going to include directly impacted people, if we're going to include sex workers in this work, or sex trafficking survivors in this work even, we have to find avenues to do that that aren't just them sitting in front of us during a public testimony. And I also think, I have to address something because it came up, and I need us to, we have to disrupt the cycles of these stories that we tell ourselves that keep us in these situations. And Sid, you said something about lived experience being new to the police force, and it's not. I have seen police officers and police organizations constantly have police officers testify about their personal experiences of feeling in danger, of feeling like, oh, well, this is what, this is just the way we were supposed to do. This is my job, that you're making it harder for us. Y'all, police use your experiences, your lived experiences against the public constantly. So you do know how to use lived experience. I need you to expand whose lived experience you're including and respecting. And I need you to bring that back.
Thank you. Thank you, Justice.
This is really important for the work of this committee, because unless we can stop using the same language, we are not going to make a big change. And it's not personal, but I really need you to reflect on that point that she made and think about what it means for who we are conversing with and who and how we are respecting not just people who are empowered by our state, but the people who are not empowered by our state.
The folks who just came back into the room, are either of you interested in testifying today, speaking before the group? Okay, thank you, thank you. Didn't want to be ignoring you. Hi there. Hi there. Okay, Mr. Wardell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm not going to, get into a debate about this, but I will tell you that go back and listen to what I said. You're taking it out of context. The context that I said of lived experience in working with individuals, and specifically to the groups that we're talking to today, in how we move forward, whether it's investigations, whether it's, more importantly to me, finding services. That's what I said. So I think you're taking it out of context that law enforcement testifying on a particular incident or how something happened, you can call that lived experience. I think that's being disrespectful to the fact that what I'm talking about in the context of our conversation was lived experience in this particular forum of the issues that we're working with. So I think it's, I'll take it on the chin, Justice, but I'm going to tell you right now, it's out of context. And that's the type of thing that if we're going to get in a situation of working together and that's going to cause a rift, it's not because I'm causing it, it's because you're taking something out of context. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I do need to respond to this because
No,
there was something said about
Justice, no.
Vice Chair. There was something said about the fear of police.
Justin, please turn off the tape recording. Turn off the television.
Fear of police is unacceptable.
Hearing from all of the members of the commission. I look forward to hearing from all the members of the commission their recommendations for our report, and we will meet again on May 22nd. Thank you.